so I've had that on my mind. That's why when I started talking about Bach. Bach had in his library a manuscript, a treatise on counterpoint, which was written in 1725. You know what counterpoint is? Counterpoint is when you have two or more melodies that are written that coincide, but they're different melodies, but you're hearing them at the same time, and they kind of play off of each other. So that's we have point counterpoint, which we think relates to debate. Okay, but in music you have counterpoint where, and Bach was a master of this, particularly in the form called the fugue, where you have one line that comes in and the same line is repeated by a different voice, and meanwhile the first voice goes and does another line, and he's brilliant and kind of weaves these things together. And in Bach's view, this wasn't just fun or neat. It was a lot deeper than that. I always like to say that life is more like counterpoint than PowerPoint, by the way. One of the manuscripts in Bach's library was this treatise on counterpoint, written in 1725. Bach, by the way, is 1685 to 1750, so this is 25 years before he died. The author, Johann Joseph Fuchs, referred to, this is all a lead up just for this one sentence, art which imitates and perfects nature but never destroys it. Art imitates and perfects nature, never destroys it. The idea of art imitating nature is an ancient one. It's still alive in the 18th century, although it's about ready to die. Now that idea, first articulated in Aristotle, was one that this very Lutheran Bach also embraced. I say that because Luther didn't think very highly of Aristotle, if you've read any of Luther. But Bach, very much a Lutheran, still believed, as Aristotle did, that nature, that the structure of things in creation is the source of the best art. Bach scholar Christoph Wolff argued in his recent biography, for Bach, art lay between the reality of the world and God who ordered this reality. In Bach's thinking and in his composing, musical structure, which was often called harmonia, our word for harmony, didn't refer just to different parts blending together, but the whole idea of musical structure. Musical structure ultimately referred to the order of nature and so to its divine cause. And hundreds of Bach scholars and musicians have suggested that when you listen to some of Bach's fugues, you're getting a kind of inside look at what the whole universe sounds like. That if you could hear the structure of the universe, not just the physical structure, but its moral order, the great dance, as Lewis calls it, or as Tom Howard calls it, his wonderful book, Chants of the Dance. You're kind of listening in to the tune of the universe when you listen to Bach. And people say that about Bach more than any composer, which I think is an interesting fact, that they would kind of, and these are people who don't even believe in God, that say this very often, and who might have a hard time submitting in their own lives to some idea of ethical order. But one of Bach's students wrote, "Music is a mixed mathematical science that concerns the origins, attributes, and distinctions of sound, out of which is a cultivated and lovely melody and harmony are made." In other words, there's already, the musical stuff is already there. Just like, you know, the Michelangelo hitting away at the marble to find the statue that's already in there. There's already a statue in there, he just has to find it. In Bach's case, there's already a few. All these works of music are already out there. We're just kind of discovering them and assembling them. There are attributes and distinctions of sound out of which a cultivated and lovely melody and harmony are made, so that God is honored and praised, but mankind is moved to devotion, virtue, joy, and sorrow. Christoph Wolff, again, the biographer I mentioned, presents Bach in his biography, which is subtitled The Learned Musician. He presents Bach as a musical Newton. In fact, shortly after his death, people were comparing Bach to Newton, saying that he did for music and for the oral attributes of creation what Newton had done for some of the physical attributes, some of the things like gravity and what we call early physics. Bach was a man consciously committed to discovery of and delight in the ways of God in creation, specifically as those ways could be known in musical form. Bach believed that there was an order in the universe that could be perceived and should properly serve as a model for human making and for human doing, for art, but also for science, for relationships, for law, for agriculture, for politics, and for the life of the church. In that older way of perceiving reality, cultural institutions and forms were not arbitrarily or capriciously or willfully engineered and selected, but cultural institutions and forms were developed and approved in harmony, in faithful resonance with the order that God had established in the cosmos. Culture is the cultivation of nature. Now, as I've alluded to numerous times, that assumption doesn't guide the modern West any longer. Historian Franklin Baumer, in his book Modern European Thought, describes the evolution of the modern disenchantment of the world with the rise of modern philosophy and science, and particularly with the ejection of the idea of purpose from the material world. And the loss of a sense of purpose is a key thing. As a more mechanistic view, well, let me read Baumer, actually. He says it better than I can. Nature, it now appeared, and he's talking about beginning in the 17th century. Nature, it now appeared, was like a great machine or clock made of dead matter, possessing fundamentally mathematical characteristics, functioning mechanistically rather than teleologically. That is, it didn't have an end in view. It doesn't happen this way because there's some final goal that God had in mind for creation. It just happens this way because that's how the machine works. That's how it works. Not the why question gets eclipsed. It need not have been eclipsed. I mean, you can ask how and why at the same time, but it was a lot more fun to ask how, and you could get paid a lot more money doing how things. I mean, look at what pastors make or theologians make versus what engineers make. You can see why the how question gets answered more. Nature functioned mechanistically rather than teleologically. Nature inevitably began to seem less like the setting for man's spiritual pilgrimage and more like a field for the exercise of human power. But where this was understood, where that transition was recognized, it prompted on the whole more optimism than pessimism. Now, it took a long time before we got jaded with that. And you can see a number of movements in art and literature in the 19th century and into the 20th century where the absence of meaning, the absence of purpose is lamented, deeply, passionately lamented. At the time, Baumer's suggesting that this transition of thinking of nature not as something that has a kind of organic, meaningful, purposeful quality to it, but just stuff we can fix, we can get power from it, we can do things with it. It prompted optimism because, well, we like power. We want to be as gods. We don't like limits. We don't like having things mapped out for us in ways that limit our choices. So, ironically, the insistence that nature was inherently meaningless gives us a lot more freedom to do whatever we want, which is, after all, what sin is. Modern culture is about control. It's about power. It's about control over nature and human nature, as George Parkin Grant loved to say. To be modern is to assume we can acquire complete control over nature and human nature. And that means that modern cultural institutions are not now seen as expressions of meaning in the nature of things, including our laws, but increasingly modern cultural institutions are expressions of human preference. It's what we want to do. They fulfill our will. We sovereignly construct meaning out of nothing other than sheer desire.